and social stratification. So stratification refers to the way people are categorized in a society. So it occurs by a bunch of different factors: race, education, wealth, income. Those are a couple of them, but there definitely are more. Um, and there are a few different systems that are used to stratify a population. Two of them are the caste and the class system. So the caste system is set up a stratification with immobility. So people are born into the caste and they remain there. It is paramount that a caste system does not allow social mobility. That's basically what separates caste and a class system. So class systems consider social variables as well as wealth, and that contributes to the upward mobility, the possibility of upward mobility. So upward mobility is possible in class systems, but keep in mind it is limited by lower classes' resources. So if you're born into poverty, there's a chance for upward mobility, but it's going to be very difficult because you don't have the resources to accomplish that. And yeah, caste systems, like we said, do not allow that. So a lot of times when you learn about Hinduism or early India, you learn about the caste system. The caste system as being an inherent part of Hinduism, which I believe was abolished. But that's usually where you learn about it. And again, the difference between caste and class is that there's no mobility in the caste system. So stratification is usually discussed in terms of socioeconomic status. You'll see SES a lot. It consists of three components. So power is the ability to get others to do something. How you can get others to do something doesn't matter how. Could be with money, charisma, whatever it is. Power is just the ability to get others to do something. Property is basically what you own, your possessions, your income, how much stuff you have, basically. And prestige is the reputation you hold, the respect you get from others, your reputation, what other people think about you. Those three basically make up socioeconomic status, and that's how we look at stratification. And power and prestige often rely on privilege, which is a set of advantages exclusively available to a person or group. So I would definitely know these terms and know the difference between the four. They're all P's and they're kind of confusing. But I do see them on the sociology and psychology portion a decent amount. So I think it would definitely be worth your while to make maybe flashcards or something like that and just separate them in your minds and make sure you know the definition of each of them. So a little more on stratification. We have intergenerational mobility, which refers to the movement of a person from a different generation to a higher class. So we have parents that were born in poverty. They have kids. They find a way to send their kids to school. The kids end up making more money. They become pretty wealthy as adults. That's intergenerational mobility. Intragenerational mobility refers to the movement of a person from the same generation to a higher class. So say a working class family or an impoverished family has two kids. One of them remains impoverished. One of them becomes middle class. That would be considered intragenerational mobility because we have in the same generation mobility to different social classes. Social reproduction is another thing that I see a lot on the MCAT. It's when social inequalities are reproduced and passed to the next generation. So both cultural capital and social capital may contribute to this. So when I say contribute, I mean they'll either make social mobility more or less possible, either or. So cultural capital is any non-financial asset that one may use for upward mobility. So anything, anything non-financial and really non-social that you may use for upward mobility, and education is the main one. Social capital, on the same hand, refers to the ability to create social networks for upward mobility. So who you know. Social capital is who you know, and it can help you up. So both types of capital can also help solidify one's place in your socioeconomic status. So who you know, obviously, if you know the right people, you can move up. If you don't know the right people, you could probably stay the same. You might even move down. Same thing with cultural capital. We can use education to better ourselves, but the education system sometimes also just cements the stratification that currently is. So these types of capital, they're used either to remain or to move up. And intersectionality is the consideration of multiple identities of a person to create a unique social situation. So to understand their unique social situation. So for example, a Muslim woman, we can't really understand her social situation by evaluating just one of her identities. So we can't understand how she interacts socially or how she lives in her social world by just understanding her as a woman or just understanding her as Muslim. Intersectionality, it's a combined effort. Both of the two combine and it creates one unique social situation. And unfortunately, the privileges and discriminations will also compound with intersectionality. Okay, so we have poverty. So global stratification is stratification of countries based on wealth, economic stability, and power. So basically just comparing different countries. Sometimes we hear the phrases first, second, and third world. That's global stratification. So women and racial and ethnic minorities often bear the brunt of the unequal distribution of resources, which is pretty evident in basically any country. I mean, you can look at the wage gap for women. Like I just said, the distribution of healthcare among racial and ethnic minorities is another example of that as well. And then we have different types of poverty. So relative poverty is the inability to meet the average standard of living in a specific society. So we have in the United States, we have a poverty line. If you live below that poverty line, you are considered impoverished. You definitely will not have the same quality of life as someone who's making 2 or 3 times the amount as you. But when you compare that to the poverty of a developing nation, say over in Asia or over in Africa, it's relative. You would still have more money than another civilization. Which brings us to absolute poverty is the inability to meet a bare minimum of basic necessities like shelter, water, and food. So that is absolute poverty means you are struggling to survive. Relative poverty is usually set by the society, and then absolute poverty is survival, is life and death. You're unable to make the bare minimum of basic necessities. So those two are pretty different. Marginal poverty is poverty due to a lack of stable employment, and structural poverty is poverty due to the effects of the society's underlying institution. Those two aren't as important, but I definitely didn't want to throw them on there. Just different ways we classify poverty. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about inequality in healthcare. So healthcare disparities are the differences in health outcomes we see across different social groups. So differences in health outcomes means why does this population of people experience this disease more than this population? Or why do these two populations experience the same disease, but one population has a higher mortality rate? So these disparities are just measuring these different outcomes across different groups, across these stratified groups. So clinical trials, for example, have historically been performed mostly on men, and the results would be generalized to women, which has in recent years become a huge problem in terms of diagnosing and treating certain diseases for women, specifically with heart disease and heart attack. Men and women may experience the same diseases differently. Women tend to be treated less aggressively for heart disease because studies have been primarily on men. And that's the same thing with heart attacks. Men and women experience heart attacks differently. They have different symptoms. Men will experience very tight pains in their chest, which is the traditional symptoms that you would associate with a heart attack because clinical trials and research had only been conducted on men. Women will experience heart attacks usually different. They might have arm pain. They'll get stomach pain, sort of indigestion. So those tend to be less obvious, but the reason they're less obvious is because not as much research in heart attack has been done on women than has been done on men. So that is one of the problems, and that's definitely an example of healthcare disparity. So large healthcare disparities exist between white people and minorities in the United States. So since the socioeconomic status and racial stratification in the US go hand in hand, we can look at these two factors together. So our stratification in the United States based on socioeconomic status is also racial stratification. So minorities will be in lower, they're not, will be in lower socioeconomic statuses in the United States. So they go hand in hand. So we can't just not look at one. We can't just look at one and not look at the other. So actual risk for disease changes when you move throughout these stratifications. So like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, for example, these are all higher for minorities than for white people. And again, it goes back to the socioeconomic status factor. Those different factors of where they live, their access to healthcare, their healthcare coverage, for example, whatever limits them. These types of things are not available to those in lower socioeconomic statuses, which also happen to be minorities in this country. So access to healthcare is more limited, like I just said. Lower income areas have less healthcare facilities, and those living there may have limited or no health coverage, depending on your employer, depending on how much money, if you can purchase it from the marketplace. But regardless of what it is a problem. Let's take a quick look at this last question. A woman who comes from a working class family becomes a CEO in her mid-30s. She has a brother who works as a plumber and plans to do so for the remainder of his career. The woman notices the stark differences between their lives. She is noticing A, B, C, D. Take a minute. Okay, so 100% of you said B. Cool. And that is the correct answer. It is intergenerational mobility because obviously they are it's a brother and sister from the same generation. One has moved up from her working class family and the other one has remained in his socioeconomic status. So that's why it would be intragenerational. Intersectionality, like we talked about before, is just understanding the multiple identities and multiple minority groups that a person is a part of in order to understand their specific social situation. Social reproduction is the use of cultural and social capital. Social reproduction is just the reproduction of inequalities from one generation to the next. And marginal poverty is poverty that is caused by unstable employment. Oh, great. I'm glad it clarifies. There aren't any specific resources that I personally use. I think that all of the tutors probably use different resources. It's just a blend. I try to use some of my MCAT prep materials. If I have any questions, I'll go online and I'll just try to use reputable sources to get my information. And I always corroborate the information, which is something that you should always do as well. If you ever see something, maybe you learned something a couple of years ago and you read something again and it sounds kind of different, it's always a good idea to look at another couple of sources because that's the best way to get the best picture.